I'm going to face two challenges in giving this presentation. One is that I'm a pacer, so it's very hard for me to stand still. And the other is that there's a lot of numbers in this presentation, an obscene number. So I will attempt to compensate for that by having lots of colorful graphs and maps. So I am an economist with the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is the statistical analytic branch of the U.S. Department of Energy. And we're an independent research branch, which means that all our reports are not vetted by any other agency, and that gives us a lot of freedom to produce independent analysis. So I encourage all of you to go on the website, here's the plug, and find a lot of great reports we have on international energy topics. So a couple of the things I'm going to talk about today, and luckily my colleague has already actually in depth explained a lot of them, so I can reduce the time of my presentation, which is an introduction to oil trade. We talked a little bit about container trade in general. I'm going to talk specifically about oil trade. We're going to talk about the idea of oil trade through energy choke points in the world, how that relates to trends in supply and demand over the next couple of decades. And then we're going to talk about the South China Sea in particular, how reserves and production and trade play a role in that region. What I want to do is tie this idea of commercial traffic to the regional and national strategies of the countries. So I want to make that connection between an individual company piloting a ship and a country making economic policy. And so that's kind of where I want my presentation to go. So let's start with maritime oil trade. The world produces a lot of oil, about 90 million barrels of oil a day. And to an economist, how does oil get from where it's produced to where it's demanded? You draw a demand and a supply graph, and in the middle is price, and you say, okay, well, there you go. Now, of course, in this room, we know that oil has to get there somehow, and a lot of it gets there by sea. In fact, over 60% of it gets there by sea, and it's been growing over time. We have about 56 million barrels of oil per day flowing through the seas. And that's not even including intra-country trade, say going from New York to Houston. This is hopefully big enough for you to see, but the oil doesn't move in straight lines. It moves through particularities of geography and very often through world oil choke points. And some of these we've discussed previously during this conference. Overwhelmingly, as you can see in this map, and this is one of my favorites, the two most important by far are the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Malacca bordering the South China Sea. The overwhelming amount of oil, and also, which includes crude oil and petroleum products, transiting this region dwarfs any other choke point in the world by far, including Panama Canal, including the Danish Straits in the Baltic, the Turkish Straits in the Bosphorus, the Suez Canal, and so forth. And that's growing over time. So increasingly, we are focusing our attention on understanding the dynamics of these two choke points. There's lots of ways of measuring oil tanker sizes. There's two scales in general. We use the Afra scale. And the takeaway here is general smaller vessels transport petroleum products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel from country to country. The larger vessels are the ones carrying the crude oil. And that's mostly to achieve the economies of scale. It's cheaper the bigger your vessel is. And so we see a lot of these crude tankers flowing around on these long routes, and they have a very particular set of routes as we've discussed previously. The expansion of the Panama Canal, those kind of activities open up sea routes, but in general, these routes are pretty fixed. And as Claude pointed out, if you disrupt these through a disruption in a choke point, that increases the time and the cost of making those deliveries. What's also important is to look at disruptions in the world. Our agency tracks unplanned oil disruptions, which can either be man-made, militant attack, terrorist attack, pipeline blowing up, or natural hurricane, typhoon disrupting an oil platform. And in fact, right now, oil disruptions are the highest they've been since the Kuwait-Iraq war in the early 90s. So we got about 3 million barrels of oil offline, right now that could be on the world market. So in general, you're taking that oil off the market, that would raise prices. We haven't seen, oil prices are of course quite high to a consumer, but we haven't seen increased oil prices over the last few months and year, and that's mostly because of the development of tight oil and shale oil in North America. So really, even though as you can see in the graph, the level of disruptions has been growing over time, increasing oil production coming out of Canada and the United States is offsetting that disruption to some degree. And that's important because when we look at oil choke points, the potential for those disruptions is very high. And if you take 17 million barrels of oil out of the market, 17 million barrels a day of oil out of the market for even a few days, that spikes prices. Markets tend to build in those risk premiums, so you don't see too much fluctuation in how these choke points relate to energy prices. But it's really important to keep an eye on them, because if there is a disruption in the Strait of Malacca, in the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices spike. So let's talk about trends. Every year, my agency puts out the International Energy Outlook, where we try to look at 20 to 30 years into the future. What are the major trends in oil and natural gas, other fuels? In this graph, the lighter the color, the farther we are into the future. And the story here is almost all the growth is Asia and the Middle East. About 70% of the oil growth over the next 25 years comes from China and India, and the rest of the developing countries in Southeast Asia. Another 13% comes from the Middle East countries. Almost none of it comes from developed Europe countries, from Japan or the United States or Canada. And that's due to a variety of factors: technological improvements, gas taxes, changing demand patterns in driving and so forth. But all of that extra oil that we are going to be consuming, it's China, India, and the Middle East. It's going to be about over 30 million barrels of oil over the next 25 years that we need to start. 35 million a day barrels of oil that we are going to need to produce in 25 years. And where's that coming from? Traditionally, a lot of it comes from OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Over the past few years, we've seen a growth in oil in non-OPEC countries, led by the United States and Canada through tight oil and shale oil. And that trend is going to more or less continue according to our calculations. We're going to see a lot of growth in non-OPEC countries, and more importantly, in production areas that were uneconomical before. So these are places in the world where you just wouldn't have had the incentives to produce 10 years ago even. What kind of oil do we produce? Well, we're going to talk about reserves a little bit. And an oil reserve is sort of an intellectual term. An oil reserve generally has two principles: how economic it is and how technically recoverable it is. A barrel of oil needs to be both technically recoverable, you need to have the technology to get it out of the ground, and economically viable, you need to be able to sell it to market in order for it to be considered a reserve. Otherwise, it's just, carbon in the ground, tar in the ground. And when we talk about the South China Sea, we're really going to see that in action. So let's talk about the South China Sea. This graph, which I apologize if you can't see, looks at the proved and probable reserves of all the countries, the offshore portions of the South China Sea. It's a total of about 11 billion barrels of oil and about 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That seems like a lot. And when you read about the South China Sea in a lot of trade press, a lot of them mention this magnitude of resources, about how the South China Sea is very important, in fact, for those strategic oil and gas resources. And that's what I'm going to try to challenge a little bit, because 11 billion barrels of oil is a lot of oil. And for you or me, if I had 11 billion barrels of oil, my golf game would be a lot better and I wouldn't be at this conference. But for a big country, for China, the story is vastly different, because China consumes about 10 million barrels of oil a day. So 360 days, we're talking about 3.6 billion barrels of oil of consumption per year for just China, which means that even if China controlled every single barrel of proved reserves in the South China Sea, that's about 3 years of consumption. Moreover, those barrels are not actually in deep water offshore areas. Many of them are closer to the coastal areas of those countries, not very far at all from shore. Here's a map of proved and probable reserves that we put together. And the darker areas show more reserves. You can see here is that the biggest reserves are in areas that are traditionally, historically, oil production areas, because those are the areas where the oil was actually easy to extract, marketable, technologically feasible. So you see in Brunei, over there, you see in the Pearl River Basin, offshore China, the Gulf of Thailand, and some parts of offshore Vietnam. Conspicuously, what's missing from this picture the Spratly Island chains and the Paracel Island chains, which have very, very few reserves. We're talking maybe less than 1 million barrels in most of these places, which is nothing for a country, really a drop in the bucket. That's very important because when we talk about conflicts and the potential of the South China Sea, conflict in the South China Sea, and we talk about energy resources, it's really important to separate the ability of those resources to supply those countries' demand and other reasons that there might be for controlling those island chains. But the actual exploration and production isn't so viable and so critical. Even if you could get to those very few limited resources, the challenges are immense in developing deep water offshore South China Sea. There's a lot of pressure, undersea pressure, there's a lot of CO2, poisonous gas in the reserves that makes it very hard to extract. There's typhoons, as we've seen before, that make it more expensive to hold rigs, oil rigs up there. You have a variety of challenges. To a prospective commercial company, when they're looking at this area and they say, wait a second, my return on this investment is probably not all that much. There's much more easy areas to develop near the coastal lines. Why should we invest in these resources when there's so much better opportunities out there? Here's some of the areas that we're going to see probably in the short run developed. We're going to see near Vietnam and China, in the northwest of the South China Sea, gas development piped to mainland China. We have a lot of offshore discoveries in Vietnam, but those areas have a lot of CO2 gas, which makes it very expensive and dangerous to extract. In the middle over there, we have a lot of interest from international companies, but competing claims do hinder the development there. And that's really, that is a real indication of conflict affecting oil and gas production. In the Gulf of Thailand, we actually see the biggest success stories of the South China Sea, in particular cooperation between Vietnam and Thailand to develop gas resources and a little bit of oil in the Gulf. Even though there's actually unsettled territorial disputes between those countries, there's some cooperative agreements they've entered, and that lets them extract those resources. So there's a little bit of cooperation in the middle in the Gulf of Thailand, and otherwise we're really talking about oil production and gas production being done really close to the borders of those countries. We're not really seeing any viable deep water production. With the one exception, there's a Chinese offshore gas rig that has ventured rather far offshore. That's sort of in the northern part of the South China Sea. And the story there again is that it's gas. Those rigs, even the most developed, high quality, farthest oil rigs, or excuse me, oil and gas rigs, they're really prospecting for natural gas. It's not an oil story. And we continue to see a lot of interest in near offshore areas, particularly near Brunei, Malaysia, and the Baram Delta, historically a very big production zone. The Spratly Island area, which everyone likes to talk about, has very few oil and gas reserves. There is one area in particular toward the east of the islands, near Reed Bank, near the Philippines, that has some potential resources. They're not reserves, but they're what we call undiscovered resources, which means maybe they're not economically viable and we're not quite certain they're there, but geography suggests that they might be there. So let's talk about undiscovered resources. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Let's talk about the share of proved reserves in the region. So when you think of the South China Sea as the next Persian Gulf, what's really compelling is to compare it to other regions. We've talked about how there's about 10, 11 billion barrels of oil in proved reserves in the South China Sea. That compares to hundreds of billions of barrels of oil in the Middle East. We talk about 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. There's over a quadrillion cubic feet, 1,000 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in both Russia and Iran. Those vast reserves, again, the commercial companies need to make a decision where their best bets are. Are they going to go to where there's a lot of resources and established areas, or are they going to go to high risk areas with maybe not as much payoff? Now, the U.S. Geological Survey, which is an agency in the Department of Interior at the U.S., estimates world undiscovered oil and gas resources. What they do is they look at geographic formations, what's called source rock. So they say, okay, you have this kind of rock in this area. How does this compare to other areas in the world where we found oil and gas? And we can use that to make some estimates about what we might find there. In the South China Sea, a lot of those contested island areas don't have a lot of good seismic exploration activity, so we have to rely on these undiscovered estimates to try to paint a picture of how viable they are. And we get about 2.5 billion barrels of oil in the Spratly Island Basin, which is actually mostly concentrated near the Philippines. For a country like the Philippines, this is very important because this provides a lot of oil for them. But for China, this is not going to supply nearly enough oil for them to make it a viable national strategy of South China Sea production. For natural gas, the resources are a little bit more dispersed, distributed around the sea itself. We see trillions of cubic feet of natural gas in lots of different areas, and particularly in the Java Sea region in the southern part, sort of near south of Indonesia. What we're not going to see is dedicated groups, clusters of oil fields producing big amounts of oil, like the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, which produces over 4 million barrels a day. We're going to see small fields producing 10,000 barrels a day, 50,000 barrels a day, which is a lot for an individual company and viable for particularly some of the smaller oil companies or even some of the majors. But to look at it in a regional perspective for those national strategies, it's not enough. And the South China Sea will not be more than a small part of the regional energy chain of those countries. Again, here's a graph showing the percentage South China Sea related to other parts of the world in terms of undiscovered resources. We see the former Soviet Union area, the Arctic area. There's resources everywhere. And as technology, particularly shale technology, fracking technology, becomes more sophisticated, the companies are going to invest in areas that probably have more opportunities and less risk for them than the similar fields in the South China Sea region. So I've painted a fairly grim picture of the production and reserve status, but in terms of trade, the story is completely different. So here's a little network diagram we do, and it's going to make your heads hurt, so I'm going to stop it over a while. But over time, we're looking at crude oil trade through the South China Sea. And the cool thing here is, if you look in 2001, the line going into the Gulf of Thailand is about the same as the line going into China. After about 2007, 2008, you stop seeing gains in oil going to Japan and South Korea, and all that new oil is going to China. Where in 2013, China is one of the biggest off-takers of crude oil going to the South China Sea. Here's a static image we did of this. This is 2011, so we're going to update this soon. But you can see a large amount of the oil coming from the Persian Gulf, a little bit from Africa, and most of that is going to China, and then on to South Korea and Japan. This is one of the most important graphs in the presentation, I think, and this is the two most important stories here. The first one is where this oil is coming from. As you can see, in 2001, most of the oil going to the South China Sea comes from the Middle East, over 90% of it. And that's fallen through 2014, what we estimate. And why is that? That's the tight oil shale gas story. As North America, and particularly the United States, produces light, sweet crude oil, it's the kind of oil that comes out of African countries traditionally, that oil is being displaced. It's no longer going to the US, it's going to Asia. And we can see that right in this graph. We can see the volumes of oil changing route from going to North America to now going to Asia. And on the second graph, you can see where they're going. They're going to China. China is just exploding as a percentage of crude imports in the South China Sea. And that's not necessarily because Japan is reducing its oil intake. It's because the growth in oil demand in Japan has flatlined, and the growth in oil demand in China continues to increase. Liquefied natural gas, LNG, is equally important. Over half of global LNG trade passes through the South China Sea. And right now, it's overwhelmingly going to Japan, which is one of the biggest consumers of liquefied natural gas in the world. But here, the trend will be interesting to see in the next few years, in the short term, because of two principles. What happens if China develops its shale gas reserves, and what happens if it doesn't? If China develops its shale gas reserves, it has a lot of domestic shale potential, and that'll allow it to meet rising natural gas demand domestically. China's government has encouraged the use of natural gas to replace oil demand. However, if it can't meet that domestically through production of shale, it's either going to make deals with Central Asia and Russia for pipeline gas, or it's going to need to import more liquefied natural gas from the rest of the world. That liquefied natural gas could come from a lot of places, including Australia and perhaps even the United States. But that's going to make those markets a lot tighter when we start to see all that natural gas starting to flow in there. And it remains to be seen what Japan's natural gas consumption patterns will look like as well. Finally, Europe is a big player here, and we might talk about the Russia-Ukraine crisis in the Q&A section. But if Europe wants to increase its share of liquefied natural gas rather than, say, pipeline gas from Russia, where is that natural gas coming from? Right now, Asia overwhelmingly has a price advantage and pays a lot more for that gas than Europe could. A lot of the deals that LNG suppliers are making is with Asian countries. And so it's not clear that Europe will be able to afford a lot of increased cargoes of liquefied natural gas, even if their pipeline gas is disrupted. That makes liquefied natural gas very important, very interesting to look at. So I'm going to end with an observation that looking at the relationship between production and trade in the South China Sea, you come to the conclusion that the hydrocarbon molecules, the oil and gas that's over the sea, is more important than that under the sea. Thank you.